This is Larry Hedrick for Mysteries of Superstition Mountains, where we bring the past into the present for our future viewers. Today we have another great story by Jack San Felice.
This story is the story of Ed Piper and Celeste Marie Jones, called Shootout at Weaver's Needle. But the tale itself takes in a whole lot more story than Weaver's Needle and that one shootout. It didn't take long. It was a big buildup to the shootout. Well, Celeste Marie Jones, a supposed opera singer from Illinois or California, came to Arizona in 1946. She came here with a story of Jesuit riches buried in the Superstition Mountains. That's 1946 is when she comes here. Most people think that Ed Piper was here first. He got all the coverage. No, Ed Piper didn't come here till 1952. So if I do my math, depending on the month, it could be 6 or 7 years she was here and had an opportunity to meet with people and try to get something going in the mountains, in the superstitions. You see, she believed Weaver's Needle was the location of the lost Jesuit treasure. Now, just a little history. What is this lost Jesuit treasure? What was she talking about? How did we get to the Superstition Mountains? Well, in 1767, Carlos III of Spain recalled all of the priests in the Jesuit order or Society of Jesus, recalled them all from North America, South America, and Europe and Asia. They were recalled back to Spain. Some of them had never been to Spain, were born and raised in other countries, but he recalled all of them. And he put an edict out called the Expulsion of the Jesuits. You see, he believed that the Jesuits were, in fact, not giving him his 1/5 of all the silver and gold that was coming from the various parts of the world where they were at. Now, why were the Jesuits involved in mining anyhow? Well, if you look at history, most of the people who could read and write were either royalty or they were priests. So the priests were charged with the responsibility, especially in the New World, of maintaining logs of mining activities, mines, how much was taken, how much agriculture was going on, how many ranchers there were, et cetera, and wars. If there were wars with the Indians or wars with other people, disruptions to mining, et cetera, they wrote it. And he felt that he wasn't getting his fair share. Remember, at that time, Spanish, French, England, they all had a war for 100 years. He kept trying to replace his coffers. But here's the deal. This is why Celeste Marie Jones believed that silver and gold and jewels and church artifacts made it into the superstitions. For one, you could see Weaver's Needle for miles and miles. Two, there were spies in the king's court. He let people in the Jesuit society know when the soldiers were coming. In fact, they were rounded up by soldiers. There's a whole book on it, and a fellow a priest by the name of Juniper Serra wrote all about the expulsion of the Jesuits. And they were supposed to be expelled for 100 years. 100 years, okay? So they're doing this roundup and of all the priests, and they were leaving things behind. Now, she believed that the church artifacts like golden crosses, jewels that were found in various parts of the world, silver, which was the coinage of the day was silver. The money was stamped and printed in, you heard the tale, pieces of 8. Well, they had coin by the size of $1, and you could knock pieces of it off, cut pieces off, 8 pieces. You could break it into 8 pieces, and that was worth so much money. So the silver money, whatever gold there was, gold crucifixes, et cetera, were supposed to be in all these churches, the mission churches throughout the world. And he believed he was not getting it. And so he sent the soldiers out to just take them and bring them out. Well, like I said, the spies got the word to the Jesuits in the New World, and they supposedly gathered up their treasures and took it north into where? Apacheria. And that's what the Superstition Mountains were called in those days. It was the land of the Apaches. So they came up into that land, buried those treasures somewhere. Because when she came here, she saw that the most prominent landmark for miles and miles and miles, you can see the Weaver's Needle. She believed that was the location. So she hired some people, she got some funding, started digging, started blasting. She used black powder and dynamite in those days. Now, she was here in 1946. Now, here comes Ed Piper. Ed Piper, many people thought was there first. No. Ed Piper probably read about this woman. After all, it was an enigma. She was a black woman, supposedly an opera singer, and no other woman had done any searching in the Superstition Mountains for gold since Julia Thomas in 1892. Almost 50 years go by. And now here's another woman. And she comes in, and she's a different color than most people. And so she's has all this excitement about her, and she generates the story of the Jesuits. And not only is the more she talks about it, I believe the more she believes it herself. So I believe that's how Ed Piper saw it in a newspaper somewhere. Well, Ed Piper in 1952, he lost his wife and his mother all at the same time. And he had been a farmer in Kansas and in Idaho. And all his life, he'd been a farmer. He wasn't a miner. He wasn't a treasure hunter. He didn't do that for a living. He didn't know. I doubt if he knew what gold in the raw looked like. So here he comes. And there's this woman that's there. She has a camp, and her camp is up on the heights. So she can control the traffic coming and going, her people, with guns. When I say guns, handguns as well as rifles. So here comes Ed Piper. He makes a camp, not on the heights. He makes a camp at a spring just to the west and sort of to the south of Weaver's Needle. In fact, that spring is still called Piper Spring to this day on the maps. And it had running water. When I was there in the 90s, it had running water. There was water there. So water below the needle. Of course, there was a lot more rain then, but nevertheless, Piper moves his people in there, and he gathers a group of people around him called Piper's Army. And that's what it was called. They wore 6 guns about that long. They carried rifles, shotguns, and they set up a camp by the spring. Not only did they set up a camp for Piper, but Piper started growing vegetables and started growing fruit trees and roses. Here in the desert, in the middle of the desert, he's trying to grow roses, but he has water. And all this water has become an issue with Jones's group on the heights. For now, there's starting to be a conflict between the two groups. when they go down to get water for their animals or get water just to live on, otherwise you got to bring water in with you somewhere. There's a conflict, and there's hard words, harsh words between the two. Well, this kind of goes on for quite a while. Celeste Jones hires guys that are marksmen. And what she does during the day, when Piper's group is out and about their camp, she will have a marksman shoot at them, but not to hurt them, shoot close to them to spook them. And it was called dusting. Dusting Piper's army, it was what she called it. So the bullets would hit in the desert, the dust, and they'd get all excited. In matter of fact, Ed Piper hires himself a marksman. And what he does the same thing. So they are shooting uphill. So you got guys with long guns, and then you got these strange folks that are, they are clustered with either camp. Ed Piper hires this guy. This fellow called himself Jewel Holder. Well, guess what? Jewel Holder was not his name. He was to visit the Apache Sentinel all the time. He didn't have any problems with it. And many of the papers had his photograph in it. Well, guess what? Somebody saw the photograph and started getting a little question mark on their head. Could this guy be John Gilbert Strong, who had escaped from a mental institute in Newark, New Jersey? Yeah, it was him. He was given 30 years in prison for a violent rape. Now, John Gilbert Strong, alias Jewel Holder, he was quite a character. He was married, had 7 kids, but yet was put in jail for rape. Well, that's the type of character that clustered around Jones and Piper. Nobody did background checks on them. They came out and said, can you shoot a gun? Yeah. Are you afraid to shoot a gun? No. Will you shoot at other people? Yeah. Well, that's what they had. So for years, this went on. I mean, years, this animosity between the two groups. It finally broke out in 1959. Celeste Marie Jones got tired of the fact that Ed Piper's not leaving and his soldiers aren't leaving. So she hired this young man, 22 years old, just out of the Marines, I believe, Robert St. Marie. Odd that his name would be part of her name. Marie, St. Marie, Celeste Marie Jones. Jones had given some guidance to St. Marie to take care of Ed Piper. November 11th, 1959, out of the heights comes St. Marie. He goes down to Piper's camp. Piper's alone. That's why he's there. He's not going to have any interference from any of his gunmen. So they probably were given a day off or whatever, or probably, and by then, probably they were coming and going. They weren't just there steady, because Ed Piper had to have money to pay them. And Ed Piper had funders. He had funders, people that funded his operation. Well, here comes St. Marie, and what's he do? He said, once you get out of here, get off this claim, get out of here. You're not wanted here, get. And then he turns like he's going to leave. And this is testimony of Ed Piper. And when he turns to leave, Ed Piper thought this was kind of wacky, so he jumped behind a boulder. And at that same time, Robert St. Marie turned with his gun to shoot Ed Piper. Ed Piper's gun was already out. It was a long revolver, probably a .357 or .45 Colt. Bam, bam, bam. He shoots Robert St. Marie. Now, most of the people won't tell you what happened next. What happened next, Piper said at the coroner's inquest, Marie didn't die right away, so he went up and talked to him. He said, "Son, what did you do that for? Why did you spook me? Why did you aim your gun at me? Why did you want to shoot me?" He said he was paid money by Celeste Marie Jones to come and do this. And he said he'd already gotten some of the money. And Piper says, in his testimony, he says, "Son, I'm sorry I had to shoot you, but you gave me no choice. Gave me no choice." Robert St. Marie dies, okay? There's a coroner's inquest. Now, that is different than a grand jury. In the 1950s, where there were rural areas, generally where there was no law enforcement per se, the coroner went out and did an examination, did an investigation, and called forth about 6 people from the county, and that would make up a coroner's jury. And that's the way it was in Arizona all the way back from the 1800s. Coroner's jury for these cases. So he holds a jury and brings them together in Florence. And Celeste Marie Jones is to testify, and then Ed Piper's to testify. Celeste Marie Jones gets up at the inquest. She waves the hat of Robert St. Marie and said, "They murdered that young boy. He was a nice young man. He would never have done this. Never have done this." Waved his hat. He said, "They were assassins. I watched them do it through binoculars." And so she was all disturbed about what had happened. Now Ed Piper comes, and it's his turn. He says, "Well, this is what happened. He came to my camp, challenged me, pulled a gun on me, and I was lucky that I was expecting something. And because I was alone, and here comes this stranger armed, and he's acting nervous, he said, I knew something was going to happen. So he readied himself, he jumped behind the boulders, et cetera, et cetera." The coroner's jury nodded their head, yeah, self-defense, self-defense. And in fact, they acquitted Ed Piper of any wrongdoing, and the coroner's report said self-defense, death by self-defense, and wrote up the story. Of course, the papers get it, and it goes in all the papers of the day, especially the Apache Sentinel. While all of this is going on, another name jumps out of the woodwork, and it's Bob Ward. Well, what's Bob Ward got to do with this? Bob Ward is he's way out of the way. Ward's cabin was over there up Peralta Road, etc. Bob Ward, in his book, and statements by others, said that, by Bob Garman, in his book, said that Bob Ward was called upon to act as a mediator between the two parties. Well, you got one crazy woman and another crazy guy, old guy, and then you bring in a third guy. That's the temperament of what was happening at Weaver's Needle. So there's a lot more than just a shooting. By the way, 14 days after the death of Robert St. Marie, Vern Rowley, one of Piper's men, were shot and killed by persons or persons unknown, is the way the report read. And that's the way they wrote it in those days. Died by persons or persons unknown by gunshot. And that was right at Weaver's Needle. And in 1959 to 1963, several people were murdered murdered out at the area of Weaver's Needle, weren't found, some not to 3 or 4 years later, like a fellow by the name of Jabez Clapp, who lived the life of a hermit, but he liked to go around with his camera and take photos of these crazy miners. He got caught up in it, he got shot and died. Others were shot and died in that area in the 60s and then all the way 70s, all the way into the 90s. This shooting out in the Superstition Mountains occurred. Some people thought maybe there was a homicidal maniac. Let me get that right. It's a homicidal maniac was running loose out in the 70s in the Superstition Mountains, just arbitrarily shooting people and killing people. Does this happen? Sure it does. Happens today. All you have to do is read the papers, see what's going on today. Well, what became of Ed Piper? Ed Piper, by the way, had his men climbing, and he had claims on top of the Needle. Mining claims on top of the Needle. But before his claims were there, Celeste Marie Jones' claims were there also. So they had claims on the Needle, around the Needle, and in East Boulder, that area, looking for what? Jesuit treasure and looking for gold. They also believe that the Lost Dutchman mine was there at the Needle also, that it wasn't a mine that was some of the gold from the Jesuit treasure. And that was Celeste Marie Jones's idea as well as Ed Piper. They both believed in the Jesuit treasure. Now, part of this story is true. In 1767, the Jesuits were expelled. The Jesuits were in charge of recording the mining and what was of value and how much was shipped and how much wasn't shipped. But if you look at it at those days, a lot of Spanish galleons sunk, and maybe a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that the gold was and the silver was mined, and it was because when they went into Mexico back in the 1500s, and that's when it started, Cortez took all the gold that he got off of the Aztec chief, Montezuma, and then they subdued the Aztecs and took all their, and made them work as slaves. So they had this thing about gold. Well, Ed Piper works for a while, and then he's not doing well. He's getting sick and sicker, and something's wrong with him. They take him into the hospital in Florence, a small hospital, and they find out that he's got cancer. Well, Ed Piper dies in August of 1962. There were 9 vehicles in his funeral ceremony, and he was taken to this old cemetery between Florence and Coolidge and buried in Pauper's Field. Now, Ed Piper was broke. He had no money. Somebody provided a new blue suit for him. He was buried in a blue suit in Pauper's Field and in the area known as Potter's, where Potter's graves were, where they buried poor people, no headstone, etc. His wish, his dying wish, was that he be buried at Weaver's Needle. But the papers report that he was laid in the grave. Doesn't mean he stayed there, didn't mean his friends, those guys that were dedicated to him, especially young Bernie Gerhardt, who was 27, who he looked on Ed Piper as a father figure. He had no father. So he may have gone back, exhumed the remains after things died down, and actually took them out there and buried them. We don't know. Nobody knows. That's one of the mysteries. Where is Ed Piper? I don't believe anybody ever dug up. They probably couldn't find out where his grave is today. In Potter's Field, in that old cemetery outside of Florence. Ed Piper's gone. But that doesn't mean things have died down. Well, what happened to Celeste Marie Jones? Well, look, I didn't have to kill the old man. He died on his own. All I did was wait. All I had to do was wait a year or two, and that was it. She's still searching for funds. Now, where did Celeste Marie Jones get her money from? Celeste Marie Jones supposedly had some heavyweight backers here in Arizona. Bob Corbin, the Attorney General at that time, I have a photo of him with Marie Jones, and he supposedly was one of her benefactors. That he wanted to hedge his bets, in other words. He was searching for the lost Dutchman mine. When she was out there already doing the work for him, if he gave her a little money, he'd get an interest. He'd sign off and he'd get so much. So he was hedging his bet. That's one guy. There were other people that were very prominent. One owned many, many grocery stores, supposedly gave her some money also. Now, another story comes out that she charged or sold shares for $1 a piece to all the members of her congregation. And she went back to California and collected money and came back. She convinced them. She was convinced in her own mind that that treasure had to be there. Piper was. He wouldn't leave. He had to die before he would leave. It's got to be there. So what does she do? She says, I've got to go back on the top. I got to go back on the top of the needle. And she hires an engineer named Vance Bacon. And he's on top of the needle. And he's doing a mineral assessment. Could there be mineral there? Could there be an entrance up there? A matter of fact, Ed Piper, when he was there on top of the needle, he had his men working in an 8-foot slit right on top of Weaver's Needle, digging, trying to find an entrance inside. One story back to Ed Piper, why he was there. Ed Piper tells the story that some Indian friends of his said on top of the needle there are 2 rooms, and in the 2 rooms are buried the tombs of some of the ancient Indians on top of the needle. And with them, other treasure and artifacts are been put in there. Wow. Wow. So that just stirred the pot a little more for him and gave him the impetus to keep on going. He was going to be sure to get it first. Well, he died. Now, Celeste Marie Jones goes up. She gets her men. By the way, Ed Piper had put a rope ladder on the side of the needle. He put a 60-foot rope ladder, and that's the way Ed Piper climbed up. That is the way he climbed up and came down at the tough part of the needle, 60 feet. Well, the needle's over 500 feet tall, and it's all craggy and rocky and very, very difficult to get up. Some people, and I know a person that says they've climbed to the top of Weaver's Needle. I know at least 2 people that says they've climbed to the top. They weren't rock climbers, they were hikers, and they made it. Okay, so she hires this guy to get back to Vance Bacon, 30-year-old mining engineer. What happened to him? He fell 500 feet to his death from the top of the needle. So this is in all the papers again. It generates excitement. It's selling a lot of newspapers. Death sells, especially death at Weaver's Needle. Now, his friend was there with him at the time he fell. And his friend, one of his friends said that Bacon he didn't fall accidentally. He was pushed off the needle because he was going to write a report that said no mineral are on top of the needle. It contained no minerals, no treasure, no nothing. There was no opening other than what Ed Piper had done a slit that they were starting. Now, get back to Mr. Piper for a minute. Ed had all of these people coming and going, and they were still roaming around the countryside without jobs. You think about it. Ed dead, his money's dried up. They didn't leave, they were still here. And they became part of that group of people that drank in the bars in Apache Junction during the 50s and early 60s. And they all wore big guns, et cetera, et cetera. So they were still there. Some of them probably were hired by Celeste Marie Jones. Maybe one of them did push Bacon to his death. Now, Bacon's friend, he got stranded on the needle. He wasn't coming down. There was no way he was coming down that rope ladder, because coming down was worse than going up. Twisted and turned, it was very dangerous. He had to be rescued by a military helicopter out of Wright Field. So they get him off. Things kind of quiet down at the needle for a little bit, but not until all those shootings that took place and deaths surrounding the needle in the early 60s. And there were several of them. People looking for it, and they still were looking for that treasure. And they believed that the Dutchman's gold was there. Now, what happened to Celeste Marie Jones? The Forest Service had her having 10 claims. Piper had about 10 or 11 claims. The Forest Service wanted to close the book on Jones and Piper. Piper's gone. His claims are null and void because he can't renew them. And she doesn't renew hers, but they got to serve the actual papers. They can't find her. Finally, somebody gives up where she's at. She's in the insane asylum in downtown Phoenix. She had been declared mentally incompetent by somebody. She was there. So they go to serve these papers on Celeste Marie Jones. She's not there. She had signed off on a weekend pass and left. And so the government has to find her to serve these papers. They do find her finally at a friend's house. They serve the papers, but guess what? She had got over on the government again. Because she was declared mentally incompetent, they could not hold her accountable for cleaning up all the holes she dug, all the blasting she did. What is it about Weaver's Needle that draws men like flies to honey? The lure of gold is what it was. Now, it can be said that there is an epitaph for those that came to Weaver's Needle. Some came to search and some came to die. A lot of them came to die because nobody found gold or the Jesuit treasure. And let me tell you, there's been a lot looking for it. And even today, there are diehard Jesuit searchers. And they're out there, and they're looking for that treasure of the lost Dutchman's mine, or they're looking for the treasure, the lost church treasure of the Jesuits. And that, my friends, is the mystery, one of the mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.